In the middle of a stormy night, a Mafia boss had just finished a bloody settling of scores. His hands still marked with blood he hadn't had time to wash away. On the way back to his villa, he stopped to check the storage building at the edge of the property, because the door was hanging slightly open in a way that didn't feel right. He drew his gun, pushed the door, stepped inside, and froze. In a dark corner, a gaunt woman sat curled up on the wet concrete floor, her left eye bruised and swollen, her lips split and cracked, her arms wrapped tight around an 8-month-old baby who was burning with fever and trembling. Beside her, a 3-year-old little girl clung to her mother's leg, eyes wide but silent, the kind of eyes that belong to a child already used to violence. He aimed the gun at the woman. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She only looked at him with exhausted eyes and said, "If you're going to kill me, let me finish nursing my baby first." That sentence made the gun in his hand lower. He didn't know that this woman was running from an abuser with ties to the very enemy who threatened him most. And the secret she was hiding inside the little girl's torn, ragged teddy bear would change all of their lives forever. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to support the channel so it can keep bringing you meaningful stories. Share this video with the people you love, because sometimes a single story can change the way we see life. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you won't miss the next stories. Beck lifted his phone and called Sterling while he was still standing in the middle of the storage building, his eyes never leaving the woman curled up in the dark corner. "Get to the house. Bring medical supplies and formula for the kids." His voice left no room for questions. Sterling only said 15 minutes, then hung up. Beck shrugged off his leather jacket and tossed it toward Josie without a word. She stared at the jacket where it landed beside her, hesitated for a second, then pulled it over Shep, who was shivering in her arms. She didn't cover herself. Beck saw that and didn't comment. He only said, short and flat, "Follow me." Josie pushed herself up with effort, one arm holding Shep, the other pulling Willa tight against her hip. The 3-year-old clung to her mother's leg, stumbling on the wet concrete but making no sound. The rain was still lashing wildly outside when Beck led the mother and her children across the wide yard toward the main house. He didn't support Josie. He didn't touch her. He just walked ahead, and every so often looked back to make sure she was keeping up. The front door opened, and Della stood on the step, her eyes widening when she saw a soaked woman come in with 2 children. She didn't ask a single question. 58 years of life and more than 20 years beside the Moretti family had taught Della that there were moments when questions only wasted time. She turned back inside, and in less than 5 minutes she returned with clean blankets, a hot water bottle, towels, and a set of old but dry clothes. "The east sitting room," Beck said to Della, "just for tonight." Della glanced at him, then at the woman trembling in the entryway with split lips and a swollen, bruised eye, then back at him again. She didn't speak, but her look said plenty. Beck ignored it. Della led Josie toward the east wing. Josie followed with her shoulders bowed, holding Shep as if someone might snatch the baby from her arms at any second. Willa dragged her feet behind them, tiny fingers hooked into the hem of her mother's clothes. As they passed Beck in the hallway, the little girl looked up at him, and her reaction came instantly. Willa screamed. Not the cry of a child afraid of the dark or afraid of strangers. This was a cowering cry, her small hands flying up to shield her head, her body folding in on itself as if bracing for a blow. She buried her face against her mother's leg, shaking hard, unable to make any sound except ragged, terrified breaths. Josie dropped to her knees at once and wrapped her arms around her daughter, still holding Shep with one arm, whispering, "It's okay. It's okay. No one's going to hit you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes lifted to Beck full of fear, as if she were apologizing for her child's screaming. Beck stood motionless. He looked at those tiny hands shielding a head, looked at the way the little girl curled into a tight defensive ball, and something in his chest twisted with a sharp, aching pain. He knew that posture. He knew that reflex. He knew exactly what it felt like when a child learns that an adult's hand isn't meant to smooth hair, it's meant to come down. He'd seen that posture every day for the first 14 years of his life. Every time he looked in the mirror, Beck stepped back 2 paces without a word. He turned and walked toward the west wing, his shadow disappearing down the dark hallway. Della gently helped Josie stand and guided her into the sitting room. She spread blankets over the sofa, set the hot water bottle beside it, then helped Josie lay Shep down. The 8-month-old was still feverish, skin burning hot, breathing shallow and fast. "The doctor will be here soon," Della said softly. You should rest. Josie didn't rest. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the doorway, one hand on Shep's back, the other holding Willa, who was still trembling in her lap. The posture of someone used to keeping watch in the night, used to sleeping with one eye open, used to waiting for heavy footsteps in the hallway. Outside the window, the storm was still howling, but in the East Wing sitting room, for the first time in a long time, no hand lifted to strike. And at the far end of the west hallway, Beck Moretti sat in the darkness of his own room, his hands clasped together, staring into empty space. In his mind, it wasn't the image of a woman with a bruised face. It was the tiny hands shielding the head of a 3-year-old who had learned how to defend herself before she'd learned how to run. Sterling arrived exactly 15 minutes after the call, a medical bag slung over his shoulder and the calm face of a man who was used to being dragged out of bed at midnight. He was 62, his gray hair cut short in a military style, his hands large but astonishingly steady for someone his age. 20 years in military medicine and 15 as a federal medical examiner, before he retired to serve the Moretti family privately, had given him eyes that could read the human body like a book. Della led him into the East Wing sitting room. Josie drew in on herself when she saw another unfamiliar man walk in, instinctively pulling Willa and Shep tighter against her. Sterling paused at the doorway and lowered his voice until it was gentle. I'm a doctor. You don't need to be afraid. I only want to check the baby's fever. Is that all right? Josie looked at Della behind Sterling. Della gave a small nod. Only then did Josie slowly ease Shep forward. Sterling examined the baby first, careful and unhurried, every movement explained in advance, so Josie wouldn't flinch. Shep had a fever, but it wasn't dangerous. Mild dehydration, needed fluids and rest. Then Sterling turned to Josie. Let me look at your injuries. Josie shook her head. I'm fine. You've got cracked ribs, Sterling said, not as a question but as a statement. I can see it in how you breathe. You're leaning left to avoid the pain on your right, and you haven't lifted the baby with your right hand even once. Josie stayed silent. Then she nodded. Della took Willa and Shep out of the room so Sterling could examine Josie. He worked quietly, professionally, but every new thing he found made his jaw tighten a little more. 2 ribs on the right were cracked, and one showed signs of an older break that had healed the wrong way. Bruises in different stages, from faded yellow to fresh dark purple, ran along her back, her hip, her arms. On her neck were 2 faint parallel marks, a shape that couldn't be mistaken for anything except human fingers. Sterling finished, pulled the blanket back over Josie, told her to rest. Then he stepped into the hallway where Beck was leaning against the wall, arms folded across his chest. Talk, Beck said. Sterling closed the door and lowered his voice. 2 cracked ribs and 1 old fracture, patterned bruising over months. Not a single incident, but ongoing, regular. Someone's been beating her like it was scheduled. He paused, his voice heavier. And her neck, Beck. Someone tried to strangle her at least twice. The most recent was about 2 weeks ago. A little more pressure and she wouldn't be sitting here tonight. Beck said nothing. His face didn't change, but his eyes darkened with every sentence Sterling spoke. The old doctor looked at him and let out a slow breath. I've written too many autopsy reports on women with injuries just like that. The woman in that room is alive only because she ran fast enough. Sterling squeezed Beck's shoulder, then headed toward the stairs. Beck stayed alone in the hallway. Through the door that wasn't fully closed, he heard something strange. Josie was singing. Her voice was small, so soft it was almost only breath shaped into melody, trembling on the higher notes but not breaking. She was singing Shep to sleep, a lullaby whose words Beck didn't understand, but whose feeling he did. It was the voice of a mother holding her child in the dark, a song meant to soothe the baby and steady herself, telling herself that tonight would pass, that tomorrow would be better. Beck stood still in the hallway, his back against the wall, his eyes closing. This house had been silent for years. No laughter, no singing, no sound of children crying, only the heavy footsteps of men coming to talk business, and the sound of doors shutting behind them. Now, in the middle of a stormy night, through the door of the east sitting room, the house held a lullaby for the first time. Soft footsteps behind him made Beck open his eyes. Della was there, carrying a tray of warm milk for the children. She looked at him, looked at the half-closed door where the song still drifted out, then looked back at him. You said it was only for tonight, Della murmured, And tomorrow morning you're going to throw a mother with broken ribs and 2 children out onto the street?" Beck didn't answer. Della tilted her head, her voice gentle but cutting deep like a blade. "You're more like your father than you think." The words hit Beck in the center of the chest like a bullet. His father, Frank Moretti, the drunk who ruled the family with his fists through Beck's childhood. The man who, in one of his rages, beat Bertie, Beck's 5-year-old sister, beat her until she couldn't cry anymore, until she couldn't breathe anymore. Della knew. She knew everything. She'd been with the Moretti family since before Bertie was born, and she'd never forgiven herself for not saving that little girl that night. And now she was looking at Beck with eyes that asked the question without speaking it. Would he be the man who threw them out, or would he be different from his father? Beck didn't answer Della. He took the tray from her hands, carried it himself, set it down outside the sitting room door, and walked away without knocking. Della watched his shadow disappear at the end of the hallway. She didn't smile. But she already knew the answer. The first gray light of morning hadn't even slipped through the curtains yet when Josie was already awake. She couldn't sleep more than 2 hours. Every small sound in the unfamiliar house yanked her upright, her hand moving automatically to check that Shep and Willa were still there beside her. The habit of someone who'd learned to sleep by survival instinct, not by safety. She eased the 2 children, still sleeping, onto the sofa, tucked the blanket around them carefully, then quietly stepped out of the room. The kitchen was wide, spotless, filled with appliances Josie had never seen in her life. She didn't sit down. She found a rag and began to scrub the kitchen floor with her left hand, because every time she lifted her right side, her ribs flared with pain so sharp it made her vision go dark. Della came into the kitchen when the day had fully broken and stopped short at the sight of Josie kneeling on the floor, wiping each tile with one hand while the other held her hip to keep her steady. "What are you doing?" Della asked, her voice caught between surprise and heartache. "I'm not used to doing nothing in someone else's house," Josie answered without looking up. There was no pride in it, no stubbornness. It was the voice of someone who'd learned that if you weren't useful, you'd be thrown out, or worse. Della wanted to say something, but heavy footsteps from the hallway cut her off. Beck appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still wet, his eyes showing he hadn't slept much more than Josie had. He looked at her on the floor, looked at the way she tried to scrub straight with one hand, then said in a voice, with no hesitation at all, "The storm's passed. You should leave." Josie stopped moving. She didn't lift her head to look at him. She only set the rag down on the floor, rose slowly, and nodded. "I understand. Thank you for letting us stay the night." No tears, no pleading, no expression at all except the quiet resignation of someone used to being pushed out, used to being refused, used to making herself as small as possible so she wouldn't take up anyone's space. Josie went back to the sitting room, woke the children, dressed Shep in the dry clothes Della had given her last night, then gathered everything into the only wet plastic bag she had. The entire life of a 27-year-old mother with 2 small children packed into a torn plastic bag. Della stood in the hallway watching, her hands clenched tight around her apron, but she didn't say anything. She'd lived long enough with Beck Moretti to know when to speak and when words would only make everything worse. Beck stood at the window of his study, looking out at the front yard. He watched Josie step out the front door, Shep in one arm, Willa's hand in the other. She stepped down the first stone step, then the second. Willa followed her mother, tiny legs moving over the wet, slick steps after the rain. On the third step, the little girl's foot slipped. Willa pitched forward, both knees striking the edge of the stone. Blood welled immediately, bright red against skin gone pale. Josie turned, her mouth opening to cry out, but Willa handled everything before her mother could even react. The child didn't cry. Not a single tear. Not a single whimper. The 3-year-old pushed herself up, looked down at her bleeding knees, then wiped the blood away with her sleeve. Done. Then she kept walking. She kept walking as if falling and bleeding were just a normal part of being alive, like breathing, like walking, like staying quiet. Beck watched it through the window, his hand clenched on the sill until his knuckles went white. A normal 3-year-old would cry when she fell. She'd call for her mother. She'd hold her knees out to be kissed better. But this child had learned that crying didn't bring comfort. It only brought more pain. That tears didn't call an embrace. They called a fist. That the safest way to survive was to make no sound at all. Get up on your own, wipe away your own blood, and keep going. 3 years old. Josie had gone several yards toward the dirt road that led to the gate when she heard her name called from behind. Josie. She stopped but didn't turn her head. Come back. Josie turned slowly. Beck stood on the top step, his face still cold, but his jaw was clenched, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't read. A week, he said. You've got a week to recover. Then you leave. Josie looked at him for a long time, as if weighing whether this was a trap or pity, what the price would be, what she would owe this man by next week. Then she nodded. A week. She turned back, carried Shep up the steps, and led Willa past Beck without looking at him. Willa still didn't cry. Blood from her knees dotted the stone steps, red on gray. A small trace left behind by a child who'd grown up too fast in a world that had been too cruel. Josie kept her word. She turned herself into a ghost inside Beck Moretti's house. Every morning she woke before dawn, before even Della did, before the first birdsong rose from the oak woods outside. She changed Shep's diaper, fed both children, washed their clothes by hand in the bathroom sink because she didn't dare use the washing machine, afraid the noise would give her away, then cleaned the sitting room until it looked as if no one had ever been there at all. By the time Della stepped into the kitchen each morning, Josie had finished everything and sat silently in the corner nursing Shep, her eyes always angled toward the door like she was standing watch. She didn't leave the east wing. She didn't go into any room except the sitting room and the kitchen. She used nothing except what Della set out for her. She shrank herself as small as possible, took up as little space as possible, existed while leaving almost no trace, as if she'd trained her whole life for exactly this. Della watched and understood. She didn't force Josie to talk, didn't ask about the past, didn't perform pity. Instead, she did small things without words. An extra pillow on the sofa, a bowl of hot porridge set on the kitchen table before Josie woke up, even though Josie always woke earlier. A set of children's clothes folded neatly and left by the door, with no explanation. Josie accepted each thing with a small nod, and eyes gone red that she tried to hide by turning away. The two women didn't speak much, but between them a kind of bond began to form without language. The bond of people who understood that sometimes quiet kindness was worth more than 1,000 consoling words. On the afternoon of the third day, Della passed the sitting room and stopped at the doorway. Josie was sitting on the floor with Willa, her finger tracing shapes on the polished wood. "This is the watchtower," Josie said softly, drawing a straight line upward. "And this is the dragon that protects the castle. This dragon doesn't bite anyone. It just keeps watch so the princess can sleep well." Willa followed her mother's moving finger, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, completely pulled into the imaginary world Josie was building out of nothing on an empty floor. No toys, no books, no crayons, only a mother's finger and an imagination nothing could break. Turning a cold corner of a sitting room into a castle with a watchtower and a gentle dragon, Della eased back quietly, unwilling to break that moment. She wiped her eyes with the edge of her apron as she went into the kitchen. By day, Josie was a ghost, but at night, she couldn't hide the darkness inside her. On the fourth night, Beck was sitting in his West Wing study, going over numbers from last week's deal, when he heard a scream. Not a loud scream. It was choked off, squeezed tight, like the sound of someone trying to scream, while a hand covered her mouth. Beck set his glass of liquor down and stepped into the hallway. The scream was coming from the east sitting room. He walked to the door and stopped. Through the thick wooden door, Josie's voice carried out in broken pieces, delirious, panicked. "Don't hit my baby. Hit me instead. Please don't hit my baby." Then a sob, then silence. Then again, Don't hit my baby." Beck put his hand on the doorknob. His fingers clamped around the cold metal until his knuckles went white. He stood like that for a long time. A minute, 2 minutes, maybe longer. What would happen if he opened the door? What would he say? What would he do? He was Beck Moretti, the man who could give orders to 100 gunmen without blinking, yet standing outside the door of a woman dreaming of her child being beaten. He didn't know what to do. He didn't open it. He let go of the knob, stepped back, and leaned against the wall across from the door until the delirium softened into steady breathing. Then he went back to his room and didn't sleep another second that night. The fifth day brought something Beck wasn't prepared for. He was sitting on the porch with a cup of black coffee in the early sunlight, one of the rare moments he allowed himself not to think about work, when he heard tiny footsteps on the wooden boards. He turned. Willa stood about 3 steps away, staring at him. Beck didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't make a single motion that might frighten her. For the first time since they'd arrived, Willa didn't cry at the sight of him. The little girl tilted her head at Beck, as if she were measuring him, weighing him, with a survival instinct no 3-year-old should ever have. Then she took one step forward, bent down, and set a wildflower on the porch floor in front of him. A tiny flower, its white petals slightly bruised, something she must have picked up by the roadside when Della took her into the garden this morning. Willa placed the flower down, looked up at Beck one more time, then turned and ran, her small feet tapping on the wood as she disappeared back into the house. Beck stared at the flower. He bent and picked it up, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. The petals were thin as paper, soft, breakable. He didn't set it down. He didn't throw it away. All that day, through calls with partners, through a meeting with Pax about the new shipment, through lunch eaten alone in his study, the wildflower stayed in the pocket of Beck Moretti's suit jacket, and he never even noticed it was there. On the night of the 5th day, after Josie and the children had gone into their room, Beck called Pax to the West Wing study. His younger brother showed up within half an hour, 33 years old, built more solidly than Beck but half a head shorter, carrying a laptop and a thick envelope. Pax took the chair across the desk, opened the laptop, and looked at his brother with the expression Beck had known for 20 years, the look of someone who already knew this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "What'd you find?" Beck asked, clipped. Pax turned the screen toward him. Josephine Marie Calloway, 27, born in Macon, Georgia. Her mother died when she was 12. Her father left before that. She grew up in the foster system, married at 21 to Brock Hadley. Pax scrolled, pulling up a string of files. Brock Hadley, 34, former Macon Police Department officer, fired 3 years ago for excessive force on duty. He beat a suspect into the hospital during an interrogation, and that suspect turned out to be innocent. Before that, he'd already been warned twice for unnecessary force, but co-workers covered for him. After he was fired, he picked up an assault charge in a bar, got a suspended sentence. Pax paused and looked at him. And here's the part you need to hear carefully. 4 months ago, Brock Hadley reported his wife missing. He told police Josie was severely mentally unstable, self-destructive, and had kidnapped their 2 children and run in the night. He petitioned for a court order to locate her and for emergency custody on the grounds that the mother was mentally unfit. Beck said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He thought of the woman sleeping in the East Wing, the woman who woke before dawn to scrub floors with a ribcage that felt broken, the woman who used her finger to draw castles on the floor for her daughter, mentally unstable, kidnapped her children. He'd turned the victim into the criminal, right there on paper. "There's more," Pax said, his voice lower. He opened another page on the laptop. "This part surprised me. After he got fired, Brock needed money and protection. He started doing dirty work for this man." Pax turned the screen. A photo filled it. A 55-year-old man with salt and pepper hair, a square face, eyes cold as frozen water. Beck didn't need an introduction. Sal Vaccaro, the boss who controlled everything underground from Jacksonville to Charleston. Beck's biggest direct rival for the past 10 years. They'd been locked in strategic stalemate for years. Neither side was strong enough to swallow the other, but both men knew that one small mistake could tilt the balance. "What does Brock do for Sal?" Beck asked, his voice strangely calm. "Collections, threats, a few small shipments. He's low-level muscle, no brain. But he's loyal to Sal because Sal gives him money and the legal protection he lost when he got kicked off the force." Pax closed the laptop and looked straight at his brother. "You understand what this means, right? Brock Hadley isn't just an abusive husband. He's one of Sal Vaccaro's pieces. And the woman sleeping in your East Wing is the wife of that piece." Beck didn't answer. "If Sal finds out she's here," Pax went on, tension tightening his voice, "he'll use her as leverage. He'll know you're sheltering his man's wife, and he'll twist that into a weapon. Or he'll push Brock to come here and start trouble to drag you into a legal mess. Or he'll use this information to shake your partners. Either way, her being here is a risk." Silence stretched between the brothers. Pax had known Beck long enough not to fill that silence with useless words. Finally, Beck spoke. "Does she know about Sal?" "Nothing suggests she does. Looks like she only knows Brock was a violent ex-cop. The underground ties behind it don't seem to be on her radar." Beck nodded slowly. Pax stood, slid the laptop into his bag. At the door he stopped and looked back at Beck. "Bro, I know what you're thinking. But logic says the safest move is to let her go, as soon as possible. Beck didn't look at his brother. He was staring down at the desk, where the tiny wildflower Willa had placed in front of him that morning still lay beside a stack of papers. He didn't remember when he'd taken it out of his pocket. 2 more days and the week's up, Beck said. We'll deal with it then. Pax glanced at the flower on the desk, glanced at his brother, then shook his head and walked out without another word. The 7th day came faster than Beck expected. He woke earlier than usual, sat in his study with a cup of black coffee gone cold, and stared into empty space. Pax's file was still on the desk. Brock Hadley, Sal Vaccaro. Those 2 names twisted together into a noose, and any decision he made could tighten it. Reason said it plainly. Let her go. Josie Calloway was the wife of his enemy's pawn. Keeping her here meant putting himself in a weaker position. All Sal Vaccaro needed was one small detail, and he could turn it into a weapon. Logic didn't allow Beck to keep these 3 people under his roof for 1 more day. Beck stood, walked into the hallway, ready to say the sentence he'd rehearsed in his head all night. Time's up. You have to go. But when he reached the door of the east sitting room, Josie had already gathered everything before he could even open his mouth. She stood in the middle of the room, Shep in her arms still breathing heavy because he wasn't fully better. The only plastic bag she owned at her feet. Inside it, a few changes of clothes Della had given her. Willa stood beside her mother, fingers gripping the hem of her shirt, eyes fixed on the floor. Josie saw Beck in the doorway and gave a small nod. I know. A week. She didn't wait for him to speak. She bent to lift the bag, pulled Willa close against her hip, and headed for the door. Every step she took was straight and steady. No shaking, no hesitation. The posture of someone used to walking away from temporary places, used to gathering herself and leaving before she could be thrown out, used to accepting that nowhere in this world would ever be hers long enough to call home. Josie passed Beck at the sitting room doorway without looking at him. She didn't thank him again because she'd already said it, and she wasn't the kind of person who repeated herself. Della stood at the far end of the hallway, both hands clenched around her apron, her lips pressed into a hard line. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. Josie reached the entryway and placed her hand on the front door handle. At that moment, Willa let go of her mother's shirt. The little girl didn't follow Josie toward the door. She turned and ran the other way, tiny feet pattering on the wooden floor, straight toward Beck in the hallway. Beck went still. Willa stopped right in front of him and looked up with wide, clear eyes, still carrying a trace of fear, but also something else Beck couldn't name. Then she lifted her small hand and grabbed the leg of his pants. She didn't say a word. She just held on, 5 tiny fingers clutching fabric, gripping tight, as if the pant leg of a Mafia boss was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. Beck stared down at that hand. Then he looked up. Josie had turned back from the front door. She stood a full hallway away, eyes on her daughter, then on him. She didn't call Willa back. She didn't pull her child away. She simply stood there, thin and pale, holding an 8-month-old baby still running a fever. The torn plastic bag slung over her shoulder, and looked at Beck with eyes that weren't begging, yet no longer had the strength to hide despair. She didn't know where to go. She had no money, no car, no one in this world. She had a sick baby, a 3-year-old who was used to being hit, and an ex-cop husband hunting her across America with a court order and a lie on paper that said she'd kidnapped her own children, and she was still preparing to walk out that door without saying a word. Beck looked down at Willa, still gripping his pant leg, looked back at Josie at the end of the hallway. Then he looked at Della behind her, the old woman's eyes shining with tears. Reason said let her go. Brockensal's file said, let her go. Every survival rule Beck had built over 20 years in the underworld said, let her go. But the 5 tiny fingers on his pant leg said something else. Josie. She stopped at the door, her hand still on the handle. Stay. Josie turned to look at him. Her eyes blinked, as if she didn't trust what she'd heard. Stay until this is resolved, Beck said, his voice still cold, still hard, not a trace of softness in it. But he kept talking, each sentence as clear as contract terms. The East Wing is yours and the kids. The West Wing is mine. You don't cross over. You don't ask questions. You don't look at anything on my side. If someone comes to see me, you stay in your room. You don't know who I am, and I don't explain. Understand? Josie looked at him, looked down at Willa still holding Beck's pant leg, then looked back up. I understand. She walked back into the house, set the plastic bag down on the entryway floor, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her shoulders lowered. Not much, just an inch or two. But Della saw it. Beck saw it too. Willa let go of Beck's pant leg, ran back to her mother, and grabbed the familiar hem again. The little girl still didn't speak, but as she passed Beck, she glanced up at him, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth curved slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but the first sign that, inside the mind of this 3-year-old, Beck Moretti was being moved from the list labeled dangerous to a different list she didn't have a word for yet. In the days that followed, Josie began to understand that the house she was living in was really 2 completely different worlds, separated by a long hallway and a promise not to cross. The east wing held morning light slipping through curtains, Shep's babbling, Willa's unsteady little footsteps across the wooden floor, the smell of porridge Della cooked, and quiet afternoons, when Josie sat and drew castles with her finger for her daughter. The west wing held darkness after 10 at night, the low rumble of men's voices through thick walls, the sound of a hand slamming down on wood, the heavy footsteps of people who came and went without ever looking toward the east wing. Josie couldn't make out the words, but she could hear Beck's voice. In daylight, his voice was cold and spare, but at night, through the wall, that voice became something entirely different, sharp, threatening, and quiet in the way only truly dangerous people could be quiet. No shouting, no roaring, just steady speech, one word after another, and Josie could feel that the men listening on the other side of the wall feared that voice more than they'd fear any scream. During the day, hard-faced men passed through the entryway. They didn't look at Josie. They didn't look at the children. They went straight to the west wing as if the east wing didn't exist. Josie learned to recognize each man by his footsteps, the slow, heavy tread of a large man, the quick, clipped steps of someone always in a hurry, the light, almost silent walk of packs. She didn't ask. She didn't cross. She kept her word. But the 2 worlds weren't as separate as Beck wanted, because sometimes, from the world on the other side of the hallway, small things slipped into the east wing with no explanation. On the morning of the 10th day, when Josie opened her door, she found a brown teddy bear sitting right on the threshold, brand new, soft, with a pale blue ribbon tied around its neck. No tag, no note. Willa saw it and her eyes lit up for the first time since they'd arrived. She picked it up, hugged it tight to her chest, and from that moment on she didn't let it go. Josie looked at Della. Della shook her head. Not me. Josie glanced toward the hallway leading to the west wing, but no one was there. When she asked Beck at lunch, he didn't lift his eyes from the newspaper. I've got no idea what you're talking about, but Josie saw his ears turn slightly red, and he flipped the page faster than usual. She didn't ask again. On the 12th day, a pediatrician came to the house. A professional middle-aged woman with a full kit, who examined Shep carefully for nearly an hour. She wrote a prescription, explained how to care for him, then left without saying who had called her. Josie asked Della. Della only said, Beck called. She's the best pediatrician in Savannah. He paid triple the usual rate to get her to come to the house and keep her mouth shut about any of this. Josie stood at the window and watched the doctor's car drive away, Shep in her arms, her mind tangled with emotions she didn't dare pick apart. A man who told her to leave, then told her to stay. A man who denied buying a teddy bear, yet blushed when asked. A man who lived in a world of late-night meetings and fists on tables, yet called the best pediatrician in the city for the 8-month-old baby of a stranger. Josie didn't know what to think about Beck Moretti, but that night she did something she hadn't planned. Beck was sitting alone in the backyard, on a wooden chair under the dark porch roof, smoking a cigar and staring into the blackness of the oak woods. Josie stepped out the back door, a cup of hot coffee in her hand. She set it on the small table beside his chair without a word, then went back inside. She didn't look at him. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't touch him. She only set the coffee down and left. Beck watched the steaming cup in the darkness. He sat for a long time staring at it. No one made coffee for him. Della cooked, cleaned, ran the house, handled everything. But no one had ever put coffee in his hand right when he needed it without being asked. Carmen, his mother, used to do that for his father before she left when Beck was 10. It was the last memory Beck had of tenderness between 2 people inside a house. Beck lifted the cup, drank a sip, and sat there until it was empty, and his cigar burned down into ash. But the thin peace between the 2 worlds cracked on the 15th night. Josie woke when Shep cried for milk. She stepped into the hallway toward the kitchen to warm the bottle, and at that exact moment, the West Wing door opened. Pax came out first. Behind him was a man with his hands tied, his mouth taped shut, his face smeared with blood, one eye swollen so badly he couldn't open it. The man was dragged down the hallway, head hanging, feet scraping the wooden floor, and leaving a faint red streak behind. Josie froze in the middle of the hallway. Pax saw her, his eyes flicking fast, but he didn't stop. He kept hauling the man toward the back door, and behind Pax, at the far end of the West Wing hallway, Beck stood there. His shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on the back of his right hand were red marks that weren't his. His eyes met Josie's across the long stretch of hallway. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He didn't say, "You shouldn't have seen this." He only looked at her with eyes that made one thing plain. "This is me. This is my world. I warned you." Josie swallowed hard, clutching the bottle, stepped back twice, then turned and went into the kitchen. She warmed the milk for Shep, fed him, laid him back down. Then she lay beside both children, eyes wide open in the dark, and for the first time she asked herself the question she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Whose house am I in? And which answer was more frightening? That she was in the house of a dangerous man, or that even knowing that, she still felt safer here than she'd felt anywhere in the past 4 years. After the night she'd seen the bound man in the hallway, Josie thought she'd be more afraid of Beck. But strangely, Willa wasn't. The 3-year-old seemed to have her own private system for judging adults, one that didn't need logic or reason, only the pure instinct of a child who'd learned to tell which hands would hit and which hands wouldn't. And that instinct told Willa that Beck Moretti belonged to the second kind. Josie began to see it when she noticed Willa watching him. Every morning, when Beck walked from his West Wing bedroom through the entryway to his car, Willa would hide behind the big wooden post in the east hall, only half her small face peeking out as she watched him pass. Beck knew she was there. Josie knew he knew, but he never looked over. He never stopped. He never did anything that might frighten her. He just walked by, eyes forward, and Willa watched until his shadow disappeared through the door. Each day she stood a little closer, from behind the post to beside it, then to in front of it, from half a face to her whole face, from fear in her eyes to curiosity. Pax was the first to notice. One afternoon when he came by to talk business, Pax saw Willa sitting on the front porch step, her teddy bear in her arms, eyes following Beck as he checked the fence along the east side of the property. "That kid's watching you, bro," Pax said to Della in the kitchen, his tone half teasing, half serious. Della only smiled and didn't answer. On the 18th day, it happened. Beck was sitting in a porch chair, reading a thick file, a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He heard the tiny footsteps he'd learned to recognize, but this time they didn't stop at a safe distance. Willa walked right up in front of him. Beck lowered the file, didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. She stood there for a moment, both arms wrapped around the brown teddy bear against her chest, looking at him with a seriousness that was almost funny on a 3-year-old face. Then she took one more step, bent down, and set the teddy bear in Beck's lap. She looked up at him for exactly 1 second, then turned and ran, blonde hair fluttering, small feet tapping as she vanished back into the house. Beck looked down at the teddy bear resting in his lap, a brown bear with a pale blue ribbon, the one he'd placed outside Willa's door a week ago. The bear she slept with every night, never letting it go, carrying it everywhere in the house, and she'd just put it in his lap. Beck's hand closed around the teddy bear, his big rough fingers wrapping the small soft body of it, and something in his chest broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crack running through the concrete he'd built around himself for 22 years. And through that crack something warm seeped in, and he didn't know how to stop it. He sat there holding the teddy bear for a long time. Pax arrived right then and saw his brother, the boss who controlled the underground across the American Southeast, sitting on the porch holding a teddy bear with a blue bow. Pax stopped, stared, then smiled, trying to hold it back but failing. "Bro," Pax said softly, "you're going soft." "Shut up, Pax. I'm just telling the truth. The kid loaned you her teddy bear. In 3-year-old language, that's basically a marriage proposal." "Shut up." Pax lifted both hands in surrender, laughing, then went inside. Beck stayed where he was, the teddy bear still in his hands. That evening, when Josie went looking for Della to ask about the kind of medicine Sterling had prescribed for Shep, she found her in the kitchen washing dishes. Della invited her to sit, made tea for them both, And for the first time, the two women truly talked. Josie asked the question she'd been carrying for days. Della, why does he live alone? Della set the teacup down and looked at Josie for a long time, as if deciding how much to say. Then she sighed. Because of Bertie. Who's Bertie? His little sister. Della looked out the kitchen window, where darkness had already swallowed the oak woods. Her full name was Bernadette, but everyone called her Bertie. She was 9 years younger than Beck. Blonde hair, brown eyes, laughing all day long, like Willa. Josie felt her chest tighten at the way those two names sat beside each other. His father, Frank Moretti, was an alcoholic. When he wasn't drunk, he was tolerable. But when he was, no one in that house was safe. His mother left when Beck was 10, leaving the two kids with Frank. Della paused, her hand tightening around the cup. That night, Beck was 14. Frank was drunk out of his mind, worse than usual. Beck tried to stop him, and Frank locked him in the bedroom closet from the outside. Beck pounded, kicked, screamed until his throat went raw. But that closet was thick oak, and he was 14, and he couldn't break it. Della's voice dropped into something almost like a whisper. He heard Bertie crying in the next room. He heard the punches. He heard the crying get smaller, then stop. He heard everything, and he couldn't get that door open. Josie lifted a hand to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. Bertie died that night, 5 years old. Della wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. From that night on, Beck changed. He swore no one would ever do that to any child again. Never. He became who he became, built everything he has now. But the cost. Della looked at Josie. The cost is he doesn't believe he deserves to be loved. He thinks he failed Bertie, and that anyone who comes close to him will get hurt. Josie sat very still for a long time after Della finished. Then she stood and walked back toward the east sitting room. Willa was on the floor, playing with the teddy bear Beck had returned that afternoon, set right outside her door the same way he'd set it there the first time. Josie looked at her daughter holding the bear, at the blonde hair, the wide eyes, the rare little smile unfolding on that small face. Like Willa. Della had said that. Like Bertie. And Josie understood everything. She understood why Beck lowered his gun in the storage building that night. She understood why he called her back when Willa fell and didn't cry. She understood why he bought the teddy bear and denied it. She understood why he stood outside her door at midnight when she screamed in her sleep and didn't open it. Because he'd once stood behind a locked door and couldn't get out, and that pain would follow him forever. Beck Moretti didn't keep Josie and the children because he was kind. He kept them because every time he looked at Willa, he saw Bertie. And this time, he wouldn't let the door close again. The story Della told about Bertie changed the way Josie saw Beck, but it didn't change the fact that she was living in the home of a man she still didn't truly understand. Knowing someone's pain didn't mean knowing who they were now, and Beck Moretti's present was still late-night meetings, hard-faced men, and a smear of blood on the hallway floor that Della scrubbed away before dawn. Josie kept those thoughts to herself for 2 days after her conversation with Della. She stayed in the East Wing, still didn't cross, still made herself as small as possible. But on the afternoon of the 20th day, that boundary broke for a very simple reason. She couldn't find Della. Shep broke out in a red rash all over his body after drinking the new formula the pediatrician had prescribed. Josie panicked. She needed to ask Della whether she should call Sterling right away. She searched the entire East Wing, the kitchen, the laundry room, the backyard. No Della. She stood at the edge of the hallway where the East Wing wood floor met the West Wing floor. Shep in her arms, squirming and crying from the itching. And she knew Della might be on the other side. Josie stepped across. The West Wing felt colder than the East, the light dimmer, the curtains heavier. She moved down the hall, tapping softly on each closed door, but no one answered. At the last door, she heard Beck's voice. The door was cracked open. Josie stopped, meaning to turn back, but the sound of Beck's voice pinned her in place. Not because of what he was saying, but because of how he sounded. This wasn't the voice she'd heard for 3 weeks. The cold, spare voice of the man who told her to leave and then told her to stay. This was an entirely different voice. Steel. Sharp. Each word dropping like a hammer. I don't care how much he owes. I care that he took my money and thought he could run. Find him, bring him back, and make sure that when he's in front of me, he's still got enough fingers to count what he owes. Silence. Then, don't call me again unless he's in your hands. I don't want to hear excuses. Josie stood frozen outside the door, Shep crying in her arms, But she didn't hear her baby anymore. She only heard the words that had just fallen from Beck's mouth, each one painting a clearer picture than any file ever could of who he truly was. Then the door opened wider. Beck stood right in front of her, the phone still in his hand, and the instant he saw Josie, he went still. Not with fear, not with shame, still in the way of someone who'd just been exposed in the one place he guarded most, and instead of explaining, he chose to strike first. "What are you doing here?" Beck's voice cut like a blade through Shep's crying. "I made the rules clear. You don't come to this side." "I'm sorry. I was looking for Della because Shep has a rash and I—" "You saw it," Beck cut her off, his voice not raised, but heavy enough that Josie felt it press on her shoulders. "I'm not a good man, Josie. I never said I was a good man. Don't confuse that." Josie took one step back, old instinct flaring at the weight in a man's voice, but she didn't lower her head. She looked straight into Beck's eyes, and in those eyes she didn't see the cruelty she'd learned to expect from Brock. She saw something else. Fear. Beck Moretti was afraid of her seeing who he really was. "I'm sorry I crossed over," Josie said quietly, her voice steady. "It won't happen again." She turned and went back to the east wing, spine straight, steps even, Shep still crying in her arms. She didn't run. She'd done enough running in her life. That night, Josie couldn't sleep. She lay beside her children on the east wing sofa. Shep stopped fussing after Della finally appeared and helped her deal with the rash, but Josie's mind wouldn't settle. Beck's words kept circling. "I'm not a good man. Don't confuse that." She thought of Brock. Brock had said things like that after every time he hurt her. "I'm not perfect." But Brock said it to excuse himself. Beck said it to warn her. Was there a difference? Or was she lying to herself again, running from one monster to another, trading one kind of danger for a different kind just because this one bought a teddy bear for her child? Josie lay awake with those questions, until the clock on the wall pointed to 3 o'clock in the morning. That was when she heard footsteps. Light. So light. Out in the hallway, moving from the west wing to the east. Josie held her breath, survival instinct snapping awake. She sat up slowly, moved to the door without a sound, and laid her hand on the knob. Her heart hammered. She eased the door open. Only a narrow crack, just enough to see into the hallway. Beck was standing outside the room where Willa and Shep slept. The children's door was slightly open, the hall light spilling in just enough for Josie to see what Beck was doing. He stepped inside without a sound, went to Shep first, bent down and checked the baby's forehead with the back of his hand, then pulled the blanket up when he saw it had been kicked down. Then he straightened and moved to Willa. The little girl lay curled around her teddy bear, blonde hair spread across the pillow, mouth slightly open, deep asleep. Beck stood and looked at her. He didn't touch Willa. He didn't adjust her blanket, because it was already tucked neatly around her. He just stood there, watching, in the dark, at 3 in the morning, with eyes Josie couldn't clearly see but could feel. The eyes of someone who was seeing another face layered over Willa's, the face of a 5-year-old blonde child with brown eyes he hadn't been able to save 22 years ago. Beck stood there for a long time watching Willa sleep. Then he turned, stepped out, closed the door without a sound, and walked back toward the west wing, his shape dissolving into the hallway shadows. Josie shut her own door, leaned her back against the wood, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Tears ran down her face and she didn't even wipe them away. "I'm not a good man. Don't confuse that." That's what he'd said. But monsters didn't pull blankets up at 3 in the morning. Monsters didn't stand and watch a child sleep with eyes full of old wounds. Monsters didn't buy teddy bears and pretend they didn't know. Brock Hadley had never once woken at 3 in the morning to check on his own children. Not once. And Beck Moretti, the man who insisted he wasn't good, was doing it every night for 2 children who weren't his. And Josie hadn't even known until this moment. 3 days after the night, Josie saw Beck pull the blankets up for the kids at 3 in the morning. Shep spiked a high fever again. This time it wasn't the mild fever from when they first arrived. The 8-month-old was so hot his whole body flushed red, his eyes glassy, his breathing fast, short, and shallow, his lips dry and peeling. Josie discovered it at midnight while nursing him, feeling the heat of Shep's forehead burn through her skin. She scooped him up and ran into the hallway, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, calling for Della, but her voice stuck in her throat with panic. Della wasn't the first one to come. Beck appeared from the west wing, still fully dressed as if he hadn't slept, his phone already pressed to his ear. "Sterling, get here now. The baby's got a high fever." He said 3 sentences, then hung up and moved to Josie. She was sitting on the hallway floor, cradling Shep, shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "He's so hot," Josie said, her voice breaking. "He's so hot, Beck. He won't nurse. He won't." "Josie." Beck dropped to one knee in front of her, his voice steady. "Sterling's coming. 15 minutes. You need to bring the fever down with wet cloths." Della had appeared with towels and a basin of water. The 15 minutes waiting for Sterling were the longest 15 minutes of Josie's life. She sat on the bathroom floor, laying damp cloths over Shep's body, her hands shaking so badly she had to try again and again, just to wring the towel out. Willa woke to the noise and stood in the bathroom doorway, clutching her teddy bear, watching her brother's red-hot body in her mother's arms, without understanding what was happening. Beck stayed in the hallway, keeping his distance, but he didn't leave. When Sterling arrived, he examined Shep quickly, gave a fever-reducing shot, started fluids. "Ear infection," Sterling said after checking him. "Not dangerous, but he needs antibiotics and close monitoring for 24 hours. The fever should come down within a few hours." Josie heard the words, "not dangerous," and everything she'd held inside for 3 weeks shattered. She cried. Not the quiet crying she'd done into her pillow every night. She cried out loud, shoulders shaking, both arms wrapped around Shep, trembling, tears dropping onto the baby's forehead as the heat began to ease. It was the first time Josie cried in front of Beck, the first time she let anyone see her break, truly break, not from the pain of being hit, but from the terror of losing her child. Beck stood in the bathroom doorway and watched her cry without saying a word. He didn't step in to comfort her. He didn't say it'll be okay. He just stood there, present, like a pillar holding the roof up. After Shep stabilized and fell into an exhausted sleep, Della took Willa back to her room. Josie stepped out onto the back porch and sat on the wooden steps, her face still wet with tears, arms around her knees, staring into the stretching shadows of the ancient trees. Beck followed. He paused in the back doorway as if he meant to turn around, but Josie spoke without looking back. "Stay, please." Those 2 words stopped Beck in place. He stood still for a moment, then stepped out and sat on the step half a meter from Josie. He didn't speak. He just sat. Silence stretched between them, filled only with crickets and wind moving through oak leaves. Then Josie began to talk. She didn't look at Beck. She stared straight into the darkness ahead. "I met Brock when I was 21. I grew up in foster care. No family. No one. He was a cop. Good-looking, confident, saying all the right things I wanted to hear. For the first time in my life, someone said he loved me, and I believed him." Josie drew a slow breath. 6 months after the wedding, he hit me for the first time. I wanted to leave, but he apologized, cried, promised he'd never do it again. I believed him. The second time, he hit harder, then the third. Then I stopped counting. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "When I had Willa, I thought everything would change. But Brock used Willa to keep me. He said, 'If you leave, I'll tell the court you're crazy. You'll never see your kid again.' He was an ex-cop. He had friends all over the department. No one would believe me if I reported it." Josie paused, her voice dropping close to a whisper. "He forced me to sign a lot of papers. I didn't know what they were. He told me to sign and I signed, because every time I asked a question, I got hit. Later I started to suspect it was illegal, but I didn't dare ask, and I didn't dare look back." Beck sat silent, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the dark. "Then Shep," Josie said, her voice cracking. "Shep isn't... I didn't..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Beck understood. He understood from the way she stopped, from the way her shoulders drew in, from the way she gripped her knees harder as if she were trying to keep herself from breaking into pieces. Shep was the result of the night Brock forced her. "But I love my son," Josie said quickly, as if she were afraid Beck would misunderstand. "From the moment Shep was born, I loved him. He didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Beck said quietly. Those were the first 2 words he'd spoken since sitting down. Josie drew a long, trembling breath. "The line I couldn't cross was 3 months ago." Willa spilled a glass of water at dinner. Brock turned and slapped her. Slapped a 3-year-old. His handprint showed on my daughter's cheek, and Willa didn't cry. She just looked at him with those eyes. The eyes you've seen. The eyes of a child who's used to being hit. Josie turned and looked at Beck for the first time since she began. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. When his hand touched my daughter's face, I knew. Either I ran that night, or I'd never get another chance. So when he passed out drunk on the sofa, I picked up both kids, grabbed the car keys, and ran. The car ran out of gas in the storm and I walked, carrying them, until I found your storage building. A long silence. Beck stood, stepped into the darkness at the corner of the porch. Josie heard a dull, heavy thud, then another. He was punching the porch post. When he came back and sat down, the skin over his right knuckles was split, blood seeping dark in the moonlight. He didn't look at his hand. His voice was calm. Calm in a way that was frightening. The calm of a man who had made a decision, and nothing in the world could move him. He won't lay a hand on you or the kids again. Josie looked at his bleeding knuckles, looked at the dark eyes in the night, and shook her head once, small and careful. You shouldn't promise what you can't keep. Beck turned to her. It was the first time the two of them looked straight into each other's eyes in the dark, close enough that Josie could see moonlight reflected in his black gaze. And there was no cruelty there the way she'd feared. Only fire, slow and steady, and impossible to put out. You don't know who I am, Beck said. And it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. 2 weeks passed after the night Josie told the truth on the porch. 2 weeks in which something between her and Beck shifted, not through words or grand gestures, but through silences that felt less heavy, through glances that no longer dodged away, through the cup of coffee Josie still set beside Beck's chair each night, and the fact that he didn't pretend not to notice anymore. But outside the walls of the estate, time didn't pause. Creed Marshall, 30 years old, Brock's former colleague, back when Brock was still on the force, and now a private investigator who did dirty work for money, had spent 4 months tracking Josie. He started with traffic cameras along the route Josie took the night she ran, working backward through every gas station she stopped at, every stretch of highway she drove, until the trail ended at a small gas station outside Savannah, Georgia, where Josie's car bought $15 of gas one last time before it vanished. Creed couldn't find anything after that, because Josie had walked from where the car died to Beck's storage building and left no electronic footprint at all. But knowing she was in the Savannah area was enough. Brock got the information from Creed and did what he was best at. He made fear. The call came at 2 in the afternoon, on an ordinary Wednesday. Josie was feeding Shep in the kitchen when Della's phone rang. Della answered, her face tightening for a split second. Then she handed the phone to Josie. Someone wants to talk to you. Says he's your cousin. Josie took the phone, lifted it to her ear, and her world went cold. You remember me, Josie? Brock's voice. Low, slow, controlled. The voice he always used before he hit her. The sweet, fake calm of an abuser savoring his victim's fear. Josie didn't answer. Her hand clenched around the phone until her knuckles whitened. I know you're in Georgia, Brock said, each word clean and deliberate. I know whose house you're in, and my new friend would really like to know more about the man hiding you. You know, Josie, you always choose the wrong men. This time, too. Josie ended the call. She set the phone down on the table with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Her face went paper white, her lips pressed into a hard line, her eyes fixed on nothing. Della knew instantly. Josie? Honey? Who was it? Josie didn't answer. She lifted Shep, hurried to the sitting room, and started packing. Brock didn't only know she was in Georgia. He knew whose house she was in, and he'd said, my new friend, which meant Sal Vaccaro. Josie didn't know who Sal Vaccaro was, but she remembered the night Beck laid down the East Wing and West Wing rules, remembered the way Pax looked when he spoke about risk, remembered the file she wasn't allowed to read, but knew existed. She didn't understand the whole picture, but she understood enough. Her presence in this house was putting Beck in danger, and Josie Calloway, who had endured 4 years of being hit because she didn't want anyone else harmed in her place, wasn't going to let that happen. She waited until midnight. She shoved everything into the plastic bag. She woke Willa, picked up Shep, and slipped out the back door toward the estate gate. She'd gone a little over 100 meters through the dark, past the oak grove, down the gravel path, when headlights snapped on right in front of her. Beck was sitting on the hood of the car, arms folded across his chest, as if he'd been waiting there for an hour. Security cameras. Of course. Where are you going at midnight, Josie? His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Josie stood on the gravel, Shep in her arms, Willa clinging to her leg, the plastic bag on her shoulder, and she couldn't hold her tears back anymore. He knows I'm here, Beck, he called this afternoon. He knows whose house I'm in, and he's connected to your enemy. If I stay, I'm just putting you in danger. Putting Della in danger. Putting everything you've built in danger. I can't let you pay for me." Beck slid off the hood and stepped in front of Josie. He took her shoulders. Not hard, not rough, but firm enough that Josie stopped shaking. "Sal Vaccaro's been my enemy since before you walked into that storage building," Beck said, eyes locked on hers. "You didn't create the problem. You just walked into the middle of a war that's been going on for 10 years. Brock Hadley is Sal's low-level muscle, and him finding you doesn't change a damn thing about the balance between me and Sal. But he can use me against you. He can try." Josie shook her head, tears falling. "Why? Why are you keeping me here? Why didn't you let me go, if it's simpler?" Beck let go of her shoulders, stepped back half a pace, and went quiet for a long time. Crickets sang in the oak woods. Willa stood glued to her mother's leg, eyes lifted to Beck in the headlights. Then Beck spoke, his voice rough and low, as if each word had to tear its own way out of his throat. "Because I didn't save Birdie." Josie stopped breathing. "I was 14, locked in a closet, hearing my sister cry, and I couldn't get that door open. I've lived with that sound every night for 22 years. He looked down at Willa by Josie's leg, her clear eyes reflecting the glare of the headlights. "But I can save Willa, and I'm not letting that door close again." Josie looked at him in the dark, and for the first time she didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see a dangerous man. She didn't see a monster or a hero. She saw a 14-year-old boy still pounding on a closet door 22 years later. Beck turned away, pulled out his phone, and called Pax. "Lock down the entire property right now. 5-kilometer radius. Anyone unfamiliar gets close, you call me." He ended the call and dialed another number. His voice changed completely, softer by a fraction, the way people speak only to blood family. "Sis, I need you in Savannah. There's a custody case you need to look at. And sis, this time it matters." He hung up and looked at Josie, still standing on the gravel with 2 children and a torn plastic bag. "Go back inside," Beck said. "No one's going anywhere." 2 weeks after Brock's call, security around the property was doubled. Pax posted guards 24 hours a day at the main gate and the service gate, installed additional cameras along the east and south fence lines, and set motion sensors in the oak woods that wrapped around the land. Margot had arrived in Savannah the week before and was staying at a hotel in the city, building Josie's legal case file. Everything seemed under control, but Sal Vaccaro hadn't survived 55 years in the underworld by playing by someone else's rules. He had someone inside Beck's network. Not high level, just a newly hired contract guard brought in to strengthen security. Enough to photograph the camera map, the shift rotations, and the weak spot in the east fence where an older section still hadn't been repaired. That map was on Brock Hadley's table within 24 hours. That afternoon the sky was clear and warm, one of those rare autumn days in Savannah when the sun still held enough heat to warm skin. Josie let Willa play in the east garden, the area closest to the house and within camera view. Shep lay on a blanket under an oak tree, babbling at falling leaves. Willa was sitting in the grass, feeding her teddy bear wildflowers when Josie heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and the blood in her body went cold. Brock Hadley stood less than 5 steps away. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd made herself smaller than she realized. 34, broad-shouldered, square jaw, eyes flat and icy, the eyes she'd seen in nightmares every night for 4 years. He wore a black jacket, his right hand in his pocket in the way Josie knew meant there was something in it. "You remember me, sweetheart?" Brock smiled. Josie didn't have time to react. Brock lunged, his left hand grabbing her collar and yanking her back, his right hand coming out of his pocket and swinging. The slap landed on Josie's left cheek and drove her face first into the grass, her ears ringing, her vision flashing white. Familiar. So familiar it made her want to vomit, not from pain, but from the way 4 months of running, 4 months without being hit, 4 months of believing she'd escaped, were erased with one slap. Willa sat a few steps away, the teddy bear dropping from her hands. She stared at her mother on the ground, at Brock standing over her, and her 3-year-old body locked rigid. Brock turned toward his daughter, dropped to one knee, and seized Willa's arm. "Come with Daddy, Willa. Daddy's taking you home." And then something no one in the garden expected happened. Willa screamed. Not the frightened crying she'd made every time she saw an unfamiliar man. Not the silent, choking sob she'd learned in her first 3 years. This was a furious scream that burst out of her small chest with a force no 3-year-old should have, the scream of a child who had found safety and would not let anyone rip it away. Willa bit Brock's hand. He jerked back, swore, and in the moment he loosened his grip, Willa turned and ran, straight for the house, tiny legs flying over the grass, her mouth screaming the 2 sounds she'd learned this past month, the 2 sounds she had attached to safety, to a teddy bear, to the hand that pulled blankets up at 3 a.m. B. Brock caught Josie by the collar as she tried to crawl up, dragged her toward the fence gap he'd crawled through. Josie fought, and he punched her again in the ribs, right where the old fracture still lived, pain exploding so hard she almost blacked out. Then footsteps came, not running, walking, even, slow, heavy steps on the gravel path from the main house to the garden. Beck Moretti stepped out of the back door, each step like a heartbeat, calm in a way that was more frightening than any screaming. His eyes took in Josie on the ground, blood on her mouth, Brock hauling her. He didn't speed up. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a gun. He simply walked up, took Brock's wrist where he was gripping Josie, and squeezed. Brock released her not because he wanted to, but because bone crackled under Beck's hand. Brock stumbled back, his face twisting with pain. Beck nudged Josie toward Della, who had run out onto the step, arms around a sobbing Willa. Then he turned back to face Brock. "This is my family business," Brock roared, his right hand pulling a gun from the back of his waistband. "She's my wife. That's my kid. Her family is my business now," Beck said, his voice no louder than ordinary conversation. Brock laughed and raised the gun, confident that steel in his hand leveled everything. "Who the hell do you think you are? Salvacaro knows everything about you, Moretti. One phone call from me and the FBI knows who you are, what you do, what you're hiding." Beck looked at the gun. Then he looked at Brock with eyes people described the same way when they survived him, like looking into a shark's gaze. "Then call." 2 words made Brock blink. He wasn't used to someone who didn't fear a gun. He wasn't used to this kind of calm. And the moment he blinked was the moment he lost. Della stepped down from the porch, past Willa to Josie, then came at Brock from the side, where he wasn't watching. The 58-year-old hands of a former military nurse stripped the gun from Brock in a move Josie barely saw, so fast it looked like a trick. Della's other hand hammered Brock's wrist and dropped him to his knees. Then she planted her foot on the hand he'd braced on the ground, popped the magazine out in 3 seconds. Della looked down at Brock kneeling at her feet, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. "I've bandaged men 100 times braver than you," Della said, her voice cold as steel. "You don't deserve to lay a hand on that girl." Outside the gate, Pax intercepted Creed Marshall's car waiting at the edge of the woods. Creed was dragged out, hands zip-tied, thrown into the bed of Beck's men's truck. Brock was bound and marched into the storage building, the very building where Josie had once curled up with her children in the storm a month earlier. Josie sat on the porch step with Willa folded in her lap, Shep in Della's arms. She watched Beck walk into the storage building behind the tied-up Brock, the door shutting, and she knew that whatever happened inside, she would not ask. But when Beck stepped out 10 minutes later, his hands were clean, and Brock still had both legs to walk on when he was taken out to the police car Pax had called. Sterling arrived 20 minutes after Brock was taken away. He examined Josie quickly. A split lip, the right ribs hit again right on the old fracture site, a fresh bruise on her left cheek. "You need to stay in bed at least a week," Sterling said as he wrapped a bandage around her waist. "The ribs didn't crack further this time, but one more impact and they will break for real." Josie nodded at Sterling, then stood up the second he turned his back. "Call Margot here," she said to Della, her voice quiet but hard. "Right now." Della looked at her, at the way she held herself straight even as her face tightened with pain every time she inhaled. Then she went to make the call. Margot arrived within an hour. 40 years old, black hair cut in a sharp, short style, eyes keen as blades. She stepped into the room carrying a leather case file, her heels tapping a steady rhythm on the wood floor. The oldest Moretti sister wasn't like Beck or Pax. She wasn't dangerous in a physical way. She was dangerous in the way a loaded gun hidden inside an Armani suit could be dangerous. Beck stood in the corner, back to the wall, arms folded, silent. Pax sat near the door. Della brought tea, then took Willa and Shep outside to play. Margot sat across from Josie at the kitchen table, opened her notebook, and looked at her with professional eyes that held no pity. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." Josie didn't start at the beginning. She said the thing no one in the room expected. I knew Brock would find me. Sooner or later he would. So before I ran, I prepared. The room went still. Beck leaned forward slightly, his arms tightening across his chest. Josie drew a slow breath, pain flaring in her ribs, but her voice didn't shake. 6 months before I escaped, I started taking pictures. Every time Brock forced me to sign paperwork, I read it after he fell asleep. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know it was illegal. Weapons purchase contracts, transfers through fake accounts, contact lists with names and phone numbers of people I didn't know but knew mattered. I photographed everything. Every night after Brock passed out, I took the papers out, snapped photos with an old phone I hid under the lining in the closet, then put them back exactly where they belonged before he woke. Margot stopped writing and looked up at Josie with a different expression. No longer cold professionalism, something closer to respect. "You did that for 6 months?" Margot asked. "Every night," Josie said. "Every night I knew if he woke up and caught me, he'd kill me. But I also knew that if I ran with nothing in my hands, he'd use the legal system to take my kids. He's an ex-cop. He's got friends. He's got lawyers. I'm just an orphan with no degree. If I ran empty-handed, the court would believe him, not me." Josie paused. Then she glanced toward the corner where Willa had left her teddy bear on a chair before Della took her outside. The brown bear with the blue ribbon. The bear Beck had given and denied. The bear Willa slept with every night, carried everywhere, placed in Beck's lap that afternoon on the porch. Josie stood, walked to the chair, and picked the teddy bear up. She flipped it over, ran her fingers along the seam down its back, found a spot where the stitching was a little looser than the rest. Then she hooked a finger under the thread, tugged gently, opened a small slit, and pulled a tiny USB drive out of the bear's stuffed belly, no bigger than her thumb. The room went so quiet they could hear the wall clock ticking. Josie set the USB on the table in front of Margot. "It's all in here. Every paper Brock made me sign. Every contract. Every transfer. Every name." Margot picked up the USB, stared at it, then stared at Josie. "You hid it in the teddy bear. In the one thing Willa never lets go of. Brock could search my bag, search my car, search everything, but he'd never think to cut open his daughter's teddy bear." Margot opened her laptop and plugged the USB in. The room stayed silent as she scrolled file after file. Her eyes widened, her mouth tightened, her fingers moved faster. After 5 minutes, Margot shut the laptop and looked at Josie with a look Beck had never seen his sister give anyone. "Josie," Margot said slowly, "you don't just have evidence against Brock. You have evidence against Sal Vaccaro's whole network. The names in here, these transactions, if they land in the right hands, they're enough to bring down Sal's entire empire." Silence, heavy as lead. Pax looked at his brother, eyes lighting up. Beck didn't look at Pax. He looked at Josie, and Josie looked straight back at him. "I know you want to handle this your way," Josie said, her voice steady, no hesitation. "But I don't want that. I want Brock to go to prison. I want him convicted by a court, by the law, by the system he used to exploit. I want my kids to grow up knowing their mother fought, but fought the right way." Beck held her gaze for a long time. It was the first time in his life anyone had asked him not to use violence. Not because they feared violence, but because they believed there was another way. And the person asking him was a woman with cracked ribs, a bruised throat, a bruised face in front of her child, yet still brave enough to take photos every night for 6 months while her abuser slept beside her. "All right," Beck said. "Your way." Margot nodded, closed the laptop, and swept her hair behind her ear with the neat motion of someone already building a plan. "I'll contact the FBI through a private channel. We'll submit the USB with a full immunity agreement for Josie, due to coercion and unwilling co-signing. We'll also make sure Beck's identity and information don't appear in any record. Josie is a witness and a victim, not a co-conspirator. The FBI will take this deal because what they get is far bigger. Sal Vaccaro's entire network handed to them on a silver platter." Margot looked at Josie and smiled for the first time since she arrived. "Girl, 6 months taking photos inside an abuser's home without getting caught. You should have gone to law school." Josie didn't smile back. She only looked down at the teddy bear on the table, its back split open, white stuffing spilling out, the USB already gone, the bear Beck gave Willa, the bear Willa placed in Beck's lap. the bear that kept Josie's biggest secret safe for 4 months inside its soft, stuffed belly. Josie picked the teddy bear up, took needle and thread from Della's sewing box, and began stitching the seam closed again. Her hand still trembled slightly from pain, but every stitch was steady, sure. She'd give the bear back to Willa before bedtime, whole and clean, as if nothing had happened, because her daughter didn't need to know that her favorite teddy bear had just saved their entire family. 3 days after Margot delivered the USB to the FBI through a private channel, Georgia State Police officially arrested Brock Hadley on charges of aggravated domestic violence, making death threats, criminal trespass, and violating a protective order. He was held without bail. At the same time, the FBI opened a federal investigation targeting Sal Vaccaro based on what was on the drive, contact lists, weapons contracts, and a chain of illegal transfers crossing 6 states. For the first time in months, the estate outside Savannah was truly quiet. No threatening calls at midnight, no security maps leaking, no unfamiliar footsteps beyond the fence line. Pax kept guards on the property but scaled them back to a normal level, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he came by without a laptop full of intelligence files. Josie felt that shift in the air, in the way Della hummed while she cooked, in the way Beck didn't take calls every hour, in the way Willa ran in the garden without someone posted in the corner of the yard anymore. And Josie decided to do something she hadn't done in this house yet. She was going to cook, not rushed food for herself and the kids at dawn before anyone woke. A real dinner, for everyone, like a family. Josie went into the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon. She made fried chicken from the only recipe she knew by heart, the recipe of a foster mom she'd lived with when she was 13, the only woman who'd ever been kind to her before she met Brock. Mashed potatoes, green beans sautéed in butter, homemade bread. Della stood nearby and watched. At first she tried to help, then she realized Josie needed to do this herself. She stepped back, handed over spices when Josie asked, and smiled when she saw Josie's hands weren't shaking for the first time since she'd arrived. Beck came home at 6, walked into the entryway, and stopped. The smell of fried chicken, butter, hot bread. This house smelled like home cooking. He couldn't remember the last time it had smelled like that. Maybe never. The table was set in the East Wing dining room, not the large formal room meant for social dinners Beck never hosted. This table was smaller, warmer, big enough for 5 people. Josie sat on one side with Shep in the high chair beside her. Della sat across, tearing chicken into small pieces for Shep, and Willa sat next to Beck. No one assigned seats. The child climbed into the chair beside him, as if it was hers, as if it had always been hers. When Beck sat down, Willa naturally leaned into his shoulder, blonde head brushing his arm, then kept eating like nothing had happened. Beck went rigid for a second. Then he let go, didn't move her away, didn't shift, let her rest against him as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Shep babbled at Della, lifted a tiny hand and patted her cheek, and Della laughed out loud, the laugh of someone who hadn't felt a child's touch in a long time. Josie looked around the table and stopped. She watched Della laughing with Shep, watched Willa leaning on Beck's shoulder, watched Beck sitting in silence, but his shoulders weren't clenched the way they usually were, and on his face, not a smile, but something closer to peace than Josie had ever seen on him. For the first time in her 27 years, Josie understood what a family could look like. Not a movie family, not a perfect family, just this, a small table, fried chicken, a housekeeper laughing with a baby, a 3-year-old resting on the shoulder of the man whose power could shake the foundations of the city. A young mother at the head of the table for the first time, not afraid of anyone in the room. Beck felt it too. He didn't say it out loud, but he looked around that table and realized this house, the house he'd lived in alone for years, had never held that much laughter. It had never smelled like home-cooked food. It had never had a child leaning on his shoulder. After dinner, Della washed the dishes, then took the kids to bathe. Josie and Beck sat on the back porch, side by side on the wooden steps, watching the oak woods sink into darkness. They didn't speak for a long time. Their shoulders touched lightly and neither of them moved away. "Thank you," Josie said softly, staring ahead. "For everything." Beck waited a beat. "Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you." Josie turned to look at him, waiting. Beck kept his eyes on the dark, his jaw tightening then loosening, like he was wrestling each word before letting it go. "I lied," he said, so quiet the wind almost took it. "I did it for you." Josie didn't speak. She didn't look away either. She just sat there, shoulder to shoulder with Beck in the autumn dark, And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to run, didn't need to hide, didn't need to make herself as small as possible. It was the softest moment they'd ever had, and it lasted exactly 4 hours. At 2 in the morning, Beck's phone buzzed. He picked up, eyes still not sleeping. Pax was on the other end, his voice tight in the way Beck knew meant trouble. "Sal's not going to lie down," Pax said. "The FBI's investigating him, but he's still free. And he's playing a different move." "What move?" "Lawyers. He hired lawyers to file for custody on Brock's behalf. Their argument is that Josie's raising the kids in an unsafe environment. He doesn't have to hit. He just has to take the children." Beck sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, phone to his ear, and for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid. Not for himself, for the laughter this house had just learned how to have. The next morning, Margot arrived early. No makeup, hair still wet, a case file tucked under her arm, and eyes that made it clear she hadn't slept after Pax's call either. She dropped a thick stack of papers on the kitchen table in front of Josie, Beck, and Pax, then went straight to it with no detours. Sal Vaccaro hired Hargrove and Associates, one of the biggest firms in Atlanta, to file a custody petition on Brock Hadley's behalf as the biological father currently being held in jail. Their argument is simple and dangerous. Josie Calloway is living with 2 small children in the home of an individual tied to organized criminal activity, creating an environment that's physically and psychologically unsafe for minors. They're asking the court to place the children temporarily with Child Protective Services while waiting for a final ruling. Josie sat across from Margot, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold a long time ago, and she heard every word the way you hear a sentence being handed down. Take her children. After everything she'd endured, 4 years of being hit, 6 months photographing evidence at night, 4 months running with 2 children in her arms, the slap in the garden in front of Willa, the USB that had opened a federal investigation. After all of it, they still wanted to take her children. The teacup slipped from Josie's hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, but she didn't hear it. She didn't hear anything except blood roaring in her ears and the voice in her head repeating, "They're going to take my children. They're going to take my children. They're going to take my children." "Josie," Della said softly, her hand settling on Josie's shoulder. Josie looked up, eyes bone dry, no tears, and it was more frightening than when she cried. This was the face of someone who'd been pushed past the last limit. "They want to take my children," Josie said, her voice flat and hollow. "After everything, they still want to take my children." Margot looked at her, then at Beck in the corner of the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. "This is Sal's tactic," Margot said, calm but grave. "He knows the FBI is tightening the net. He knows Brock is going to prison. But if he can get the children out of Josie's custody, he has 2 hostages to bargain with. Josie will have to negotiate to get them back. Maybe pull evidence. Maybe change testimony. He doesn't need to hit anyone. He just needs the legal system." Margot turned a page. "But the problem is more complicated than that." She looked at Beck. "If the court opens an inquiry into the children's living environment, they'll investigate the person Josie is living with, which means they'll investigate you, Beck. And if they dig deep enough," she didn't have to finish, "if they dug deep enough, Beck Moretti wouldn't be a real estate businessman anymore. Everything he'd built, every cover, every layer of protection, would be peeled back one by one. Josie would lose her children. Beck would lose his freedom. They'd both lose everything." "You've got 2 options," Margot said, looking straight at her brother. 1. Josie and the kids leave your house before the court investigation begins. She rents her own place. I represent her in court, and you stay completely separate. Safer for you. But Josie faces Hargrove alone, and I'm not sure she wins, because they have far more resources. Margot paused. 2. You step forward. You accept the risk of exposure, investigation, even prosecution. You allow the court to see you, to know who you are. And I build a record proving that whatever you are, the environment you provide these children is safer than anywhere Brock Hadley ever put them. Heavy silence settled over the kitchen. Josie looked at Beck, her eyes red but not crying. "Beck, don't. I'll leave. I'll rent a place, Josie." Beck said one word and she stopped. He didn't look at her. He looked at Margot. "Sis," Beck said, his voice steady. "I'm choosing option 2. Margot closed her eyes for a second and let out a quiet breath. "You understand what that means, right? Everything you've built for 20 years, everything Dad left, Everything we've built together, all of it could collapse if the court digs deep enough. Beck met her gaze, and for the first time Margot saw something in her brother's eyes that wasn't the cold calculation she'd known for 2 decades. She saw peace, strange and unexpected. But it was the peace of a man who'd made the biggest decision of his life, and didn't regret it. "I've had everything," Beck said slowly. "Money, power, territory, men, everything. But I didn't have a reason to keep any of it. No one waited for me to come home. No one sat at the table. No one cooked fried chicken in my kitchen. No kid leaned on my shoulder." He paused. "Now I have a reason. So what does the rest of it mean?" Margot looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow and heavy. The nod of someone accepting that the coming fight would be the biggest the Moretti family had ever faced. And this time, the weapon wouldn't be a gun. It would be the law. "Fine," Margot said, her voice sharpening again. "If you're staying in, then we go all in. I need Sterling to write a complete forensic medical report for Josie from day 1 until now. I need Pax to find Brock's previous victims willing to testify. And I need Josie to be the strongest she's ever been when she stands in front of a jury." Margot looked at Josie. "Can you do that?" Josie glanced toward the east sitting room where Willa was on the floor playing with her teddy bear and Shep was crawling around Della's feet. Then she looked back at Margot, and in her eyes the hollow despair from minutes earlier was replaced by something else. Fire, the same fire she'd kept smoldering through 6 months of taking photos in the dark, through 4 months of running with her children, through a lifetime of being hit without breaking. "I've been fighting since the first night. I lifted a phone to take pictures while Brock slept next to me," Josie said. "I'm not stopping now." The hearing took place 2 months later at the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah, on a gray Monday morning. Margot spent those 2 months preparing, turning her hotel suite into a command center with files taped across the walls, a whiteboard covered in strategy diagrams, and dozens of calls with the FBI, opposing counsel, and witnesses. Josie spent those 2 months preparing in her own way. Every night after the children were asleep, she sat with Margot and practiced her testimony again and again, not to invent anything, but to learn how to speak the truth without breaking halfway through. Opposing counsel was Raymond Hargrove, 60 years old, silver hair, a warm baritone voice like a pastor, and hands that pointed and guided like a conductor. He opened with the argument Sal Vaccaro had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to build. Josephine Calloway was an unstable mother who had fled her family and brought 2 small children into a home shared with an individual with a history tied to organized criminal activity. Beckett Moretti, though not yet charged, was a figure law enforcement had monitored for a long time. Placing children in that environment was irresponsible, and the court should protect the children's best interests by placing them under the temporary custody of Child Protective Services until a final decision could be reached. Hargrove spoke well. He sounded convincing. A few jurors nodded. Margot sat beside Josie without reacting, without taking notes, simply watching with eyes sharp as blades, waiting for her turn. When Margot called Josie to the witness stand, the courtroom fell quiet. Josie walked up, her hands gripping the edge of the stand, her face bare of makeup, the faint scar on her lip from Brock's slap in the garden still visible under the fluorescent lights. She wore a white button-down Della had pressed before dawn, and slacks Margot had bought her, the clothes of someone who wanted to be heard, not pitied. Margot asked the first question. "Josie, can you tell the court about your marriage to Brock Hadley?" Josie drew in a breath. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't break. "I met Brock when I was 21. I grew up in foster care. I didn't have a family. He was the first person who told me he loved me. 6 months after we got married, he hit me for the first time, and he didn't stop for 4 years." She told the details Margot had helped her organize into an order. Violence escalating from words to fists. Being forced to sign papers she wasn't allowed to read. Being threatened with losing custody if she left. Being isolated from anyone she knew. Being strangled twice. Ribs breaking. Healing wrong. Breaking again. Josie's voice shook in the hardest places, but she didn't stop, didn't splinter, didn't cry. She spoke like someone who had decided the truth was worth telling no matter how much it hurt. Then Margot asked about the USB drive. "Josie, can you explain to the court the evidence you collected?" "For 6 months before I ran," Josie said. "Every night after Brock passed out drunk, I took out the papers he'd forced me to sign and photographed them. I hid the USB inside my daughter's teddy bear because it was the one thing Brock would never check. I knew if I ran with nothing, the system would believe him because he was an ex-cop, and I was just an orphan with no one behind me, so I prepared. Margot let the silence settle into the courtroom for a beat before she continued. So you weren't a mother who ran in a panic the way opposing counsel described? No, Josie said, direct and clear. I was a mother who fought for 6 months before she ran, and I ran not because I was weak, but because on that last night Brock slapped my 3-year-old daughter, and I knew if I stayed one more night, one of us wasn't going to survive. Hargrove rose for cross-examination and shifted to Beck. Miss Calloway, can you explain to the court why you chose to live in the home of Beckett Moretti, an individual suspected of ties to organized crime? Don't you see that as a dangerous environment for your children? The courtroom held its breath. Margot started to object, but Josie had already answered. Beckett Moretti is the first man in my life who didn't hit me when I was on the ground. The courtroom went silent. Josie continued, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on Hargrove. When I showed up in his storage building at midnight, bruised, broken, holding 2 children, he called a doctor. He gave us shelter. He hired a pediatrician for my son when he had a fever. My daughter Willa, a 3-year-old who was afraid of every man in the world because the only man she knew used his hands to hit her mother and hit her. That child calls Beckett Moretti B and runs to him when she's scared. Josie paused, then looked straight at the judge. If the court is telling me the place my daughter chooses to run to when she's afraid is a dangerous place, then I don't understand what dangerous means anymore. Not a sound moved in the room. Hargrove sat down and didn't ask another question. Margot called the next witness. Sterling Briggs took the stand and presented the complete forensic medical report he'd compiled from Josie's first night at Beck's house onward. 20 years as a federal forensic pathologist gave him authority no lawyer could dismiss. He described each injury in detail. Recurrent rib fractures, strangulation marks at 2 different points in time, a pattern of bruising consistent with sustained violence for at least 3 years. In my career, Sterling said, his voice low and even, I've written autopsy reports for women with injuries exactly like this. They didn't make it to court because they were dead, Miss Calloway sitting here today is a miracle. After Sterling, Pax had found 2 women who'd dated Brock before Josie. Both testified, describing similar violence, complaints that had been buried when Brock was still a police officer. Brock Hadley's abuse wasn't an isolated story with Josie, it was a pattern. When the morning session ended, Hargrove sat at his table, his face ashen. He knew every argument about an unsafe environment had been crushed by one sentence from a 27-year-old orphan whose client had broken her ribs for 4 years. The criminal trial took place 3 weeks after the custody hearing, and this time Brock Hadley no longer had a lawyer paid for by Sal Vaccaro, because Sal was busy dealing with his own federal investigation. Brock was assigned a public defender, a young man with a pale face sitting beside him with a thin file folder and the eyes of someone who knew he'd lost before it even started. The federal prosecutor laid out a case file more than 300 pages thick, built from Josie's USB evidence, Sterling's medical reports, the full confession of Creed Marshall, testimony from 2 prior victims, FBI documentation of the illegal weapons activity Brock took part in under Sal Vaccaro, and the arrest record from when he trespassed onto Beck's property. Brock sat at the defense table, his face rigid, his eyes sweeping the courtroom until they found Josie. When he saw her in the witness section, Josie didn't lower her head. For the first time in 4 years, she met Brock Hadley's eyes without trembling. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the 4-person stood, voice even. We find the defendant, Brock Hadley, guilty on all counts. Aggravated domestic violence, making death threats, criminal trespass, conspiracy to traffic illegal weapons. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison, with no reduction during the first 15 years, plus a permanent no-contact order with Josephine Calloway and her 2 children. As the judge read the sentence, Brock turned and looked at Josie one last time. He didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't threaten. He only stared at her with the eyes of a man realizing for the first time that the woman he'd beaten for 4 years, the woman he thought he'd broken completely, was the one who had destroyed him. Josie held his gaze and didn't look away until court officers led Brock out the back, handcuffs clinking on the stone floor, his shadow disappearing behind an iron door. She watched until the very last second, because she needed to see that door close. needed to know it was real. That same week, the FBI officially confirmed Josie's USB as pivotal evidence in the Salvacaro network investigation. Margot's immunity agreement was approved by the court. Josie received full immunity as a victim and cooperating witness, not a co-conspirator. Beck's identity didn't appear in any federal record. Margot kept her word. For Salvacaro, the ending came not with gunfire but with paperwork. The evidence chain from the USB led to coordinated search warrants across 6 states, the arrest of 17 members of the network, the freezing of accounts worth millions, and a subpoena ordering Salvacaro to appear before a federal grand jury. The empire Sal built over 30 years collapsed in 3 weeks, and the person who pulled it down wasn't Beck Moretti with guns and soldiers. It was a 27-year-old orphan with a USB drive hidden inside a teddy bear. Beck Moretti, the boss who controlled the Southeast, took down the greatest enemy of his life without firing a single shot. And he did it by listening to a woman who told him not to use violence. The custody case ended that week as well. With Sal no longer funding legal muscle, Hargrove withdrew, and the court granted Josie full custody based on the abuse evidence and Brock's 22-year sentence. Willa and Shep were officially, legally, impossible to take from her now. That afternoon after the final hearing, Josie stepped out through the front doors of the Chatham County Courthouse. November sun in Savannah wasn't harsh. It was warm, gentle, honey gold on the old stone steps. Josie stopped at the top step, closed her eyes, and inhaled. A deep, full breath. No rib pain because the bone had healed. No fear because Brock was behind an iron door. No panic because her children were safe. For the first time in 4 years, Josie Calloway breathed without fear. She stood there on the courthouse steps, eyes shut, face tilted toward the sky, sunlight on her skin, and she simply breathed. Breathed like someone breaking the surface after 4 years underwater. When she opened her eyes, she saw a black car parked at the base of the steps. Beck leaned against the door, sunglasses on, hands in his pockets, calm as if he were waiting outside a coffee shop, not as a man who'd just put a 20-year empire on the scale to protect a family that hadn't been his. Della stood beside the car with Shep in her arms, and Willa, a 3-year-old blonde girl hugging her teddy bear tight, stood beside Beck, with her hand wrapped around his pant leg the way she always did. When Willa saw Josie on the steps, she let go of Beck's pants and ran. "Mom!" Josie dropped to her knees to catch her, held her tight, face buried in Willa's hair, tears falling as she smiled through them. Then Willa turned and ran back toward Beck, grabbed his hand, and tugged him toward Josie. Come. Beck let her pull him. He walked up, stopped in front of Josie kneeling on the steps, looked down at her through his sunglasses, then took them off. His eyes weren't cold. Not hard. He looked at her with the gaze of a man who had bet everything and won. But the prize he cared about wasn't victory. It was the woman kneeling in front of him. He held out his hand. Josie took it and stood. Beck opened the car door. He didn't speak. He just opened it. Josie lifted Willa. Della passed Shep over, and they all got in. On the drive back, oak wood slid past the windows, late afternoon light filtering through leaves into gold flecks that danced over Willa's face as she fell asleep in Josie's lap. "You put everything on the line for me," Josie said softly, not looking at Beck, staring out the window. Beck drove, eyes on the road, quiet for a beat. "Not for you," he said. Josie turned to look at him. Beck kept his eyes forward, but the corner of his mouth lifted, so slight it was almost nothing, the first smile Josie had ever seen on his face. For us, the days after the trial should have been the lightest days of all. Instead, they brought something strange that neither Josie nor Beck was ready for. Emptiness. Josie woke up each morning with no fear, no need to run, no need to fight, and she didn't know what to do with the hollow space that followed. She'd lived on survival instinct for 4 years, every day revolving around a single question. How do I make it through today? Now that question was gone, and she was standing inside the freedom she'd dreamed about for so long, yet she didn't know how to live in it. She still got up early. She still wiped down floors. She still tried to take up as little space as possible, as if her body hadn't caught up with the fact that the war was over. Beck withdrew too. After the words for us in the car, he almost avoided Josie, not out of coldness, but out of fear. Beck Moretti, a man who didn't blink at the mouth of a gun, was afraid of the feelings in his own chest. He was afraid that what he felt for Josie would turn him into someone he couldn't control. He was afraid that if he took one more step forward, he wouldn't be able to step back. And he was afraid that he, the son of Frank Moretti, the man who killed Bertie, didn't deserve to stand close to anyone he loved. So he hid in the West Wing, worked longer, came home later, avoided the dinner table, avoided the porch, avoided the evenings when he and Josie used to sit beside each other in silence. Della saw it, Pax saw it, but no one spoke, because they both knew Beck Moretti had to find his way through his own wall by himself. Then the storm came. Not a storm like the first night, just an ordinary autumn thunderstorm in Savannah, distant rumbling, lightning flickering beyond the oak woods, wind whining across the roof. Josie woke at 2 a.m. at the sound of thunder. Old instinct made her reach out immediately to check the children beside her. Shep was there, sleeping deeply, mouth slightly open. But Willa's spot was empty. Josie sat up fast, her heart pounding. She looked around the room, checked the bathroom, glanced under the bed. No Willa. She stepped into the hallway, bare feet on cold wood, and called softly, "Willa, baby, where you?" No answer. Josie moved down the East Wing corridor, past the kitchen, past the sitting room. No Willa. She stopped at the boundary where the East Wing met the West Wing, the line she'd been told never to cross. Thunder rolled closer. Lightning flashed and lit the hallway white. Josie stepped into the West Wing. Beck's bedroom door was slightly open. Josie reached it, placed her hand on the wood, pushed it a few inches wider, and looked in. Willa was on Beck's bed, curled like a small cat. Teddy bear clutched tight to her chest. Blonde hair spread across the white pillow. In the dark, she'd walked the long hallway, crossed into the West Wing, climbed into the bed of the formidable man who had become her unexpected guardian, and fallen asleep, because when thunder cracked, Willa didn't run to her mother. She ran to Bea. Beck lay beside her, still fully dressed, stretched on top of the blanket, rigid as wood. One of his hands rested on Willa's back, awkward, heavy. A hand trained to hold guns and hit men now placed as gently as it could manage on the tiny back rising and falling with sleep. His eyes were open. He wasn't asleep. He was guarding her. Josie stood in the doorway, and tears spilled without control. She didn't wipe them away. She watched her daughter sleeping peacefully beside Beck, watched the large hand on the small floral pajamas, watched his open eyes keeping watch in the dark over a child who wasn't his, and she cried, soundless, because she didn't want to wake anyone. Then she backed out, returned to her room, lay down beside Shep, and cried until she finally slipped into sleep. The next morning, Willa ran back into her mother's room like nothing had happened, teddy bear in her arms, hair messy. Beck showed up at breakfast, avoided looking at Josie, his ears faintly red. Neither of them mentioned the night before. Not until the afternoon on the porch, when the children were down for a nap, and Della had gone to the market. Josie sat on the steps. Beck leaned against a post. Silence stretched between them. Willa's never let any man hold her since she learned to be afraid, Josie said softly, not looking at him. She trusts me, Beck replied, his voice low. So do I. Beck went quiet for a long time. Then he sat down beside Josie on the step, and for the first time he told Bertie's story in his own voice, not through Della, not through looks or actions, with the words he'd never spoken out loud to anyone in 22 years. Bertie liked to sing, he said, rough. She sang off key, sang the wrong words, but she sang all day. That night my father was drunker than I'd ever seen him. I tried to stop it, and he locked me in the closet, locked it from the outside. Thick oak. I hit the door until my hand split open, but I couldn't break through. Beck looked down at the back of his hand, where old scars sat that Josie now realized hadn't come from street fights. I heard Bertie crying. I heard the punches. I heard the crying get quieter, then stop. I heard it all through a closet door I couldn't open. He didn't cry. His voice stayed level and flat, like he was reading the weather, and that flatness hurt more than any sob would have. Josie reached out and took Beck's hand. Her hand was small and warm against the scarred back of his. He didn't pull away. Monsters don't check whether a child's blanket is warm enough at 3 a.m, Josie said gently. Beck turned to look at her. His eyes widened, something deep, shifting, because she knew. She'd known since that night, the night she'd cracked her door open and watched him fix Shep's blanket and stand over Willa as she slept. She'd known everything, and she was still here, still sitting beside him, still holding his hand. How long have you known? Beck asked softly. Long enough. Beck looked at Josie's hand on his, at her warm fingers resting over old scars. And he understood that the last wall he'd built around himself had fallen, not because someone smashed it down, but because for the first time he wanted to step out on his own. He leaned in. Slowly. Josie didn't move away. The kiss landed on her mouth light as breath, slow as time pausing, carrying scars from both sides but also carrying something new, fragile, warm, like a wildflower pushing up through cracked concrete. When they pulled apart, Willa stood in the doorway, teddy bear in her arms, staring at her mother and Bee with wide eyes. Then she smiled. The first smile, the true first smile Josie had seen on her daughter's face since Willa learned fear. And that smile was more beautiful than any court ruling. 1 year after that stormy night, the estate outside Savannah had changed in ways no one would have believed. A swing hung beneath the biggest oak, swaying every afternoon when Willa demanded that Beck push her higher, higher, higher. Toys were scattered across the porch, along the steps, on the gravel path. Small signs of life the house had been missing for years. Shep, now nearly 2, babbled his way through the days, chubby legs toddling after his sister, his mouth spilling words only Della could understand. And among them there was one he said the clearest. Bee. Willa called Beck Bee as naturally as breathing, as if the name had existed before she even learned to speak. At 4, she laughed more, talked more, ran faster, and every evening when Beck came home, she charged the door and wrapped her arms around his legs before he could even take off his shoes. Beck changed slowly, but in a way that couldn't be reversed. He handed more to Pax, stepped back from late-night meetings and long trips. He was still Beck Moretti, still controlled territory, still a name people lowered their voices to mention. But inside a house with a swing and toys scattered on the porch, he was becoming someone else. One night after dinner, when the children were asleep and Della had gone to bed, Beck and Josie sat on the back porch the way they'd sat every night since their first kiss, shoulder to shoulder, watching the oak woods in the dark. Josie, Beck said, his voice low, I can't promise I'm completely clean. My world won't allow it, but every day I'll try to become someone more worthy than I was the day before. For you. For Willa. For Shep. Josie took his hand, their fingers weaving together the way they'd learned to do. I don't need you perfect, Beck. I just need you here. Josie found her own direction, too. She started a small program to help women living with abuse around Savannah, using her own experience to speak with women standing where she once stood, afraid of what she once feared, believing there was no way out the way she once believed. Margot provided free legal support for the program. Sterling gave free medical exams to victims. The orphan girl raised in foster care was now building a roof for women who didn't have one. Then, one evening, Beck led Josie out to the storage building. It had been completely renovated. The concrete floor was covered with warm wood, large windows installed with clear glass, bookshelves running along 2 walls for Willa, a reading nook with a small lamp and a soft armchair. But one corner remained untouched. The corner where Josie had crouched during the storm, holding 2 children, marked by a world that had been too unkind, staring up at Beck Moretti's gun and saying, If you're going to kill me, let me finish nursing my baby first. On that wall, Beck had hung 2 photos side by side. On the left, a small black and white picture, the corner slightly curled with time. Bertie Moretti, 4 years old, blonde hair, brown eyes, smiling wide. On the right, a color photo. Willa Calloway, 4 years old, blonde hair, big eyes, smiling wide, teddy bear in her arms. The girls looked so alike that with the pictures side by side, you could mistake them for sisters. Josie stared at them, her hand covering her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. I couldn't save Bertie, Beck said, rough, standing behind her. For 22 years I've lived with that sound, crying behind a door I couldn't open. But you gave me a chance to protect Willa. You gave me a reason to open the door every day instead of closing it. He paused. Stay with me, Josie. Josie turned to him, tears soaking her face, but she smiled. I've stayed since the first night, Beck. I was just waiting for you to realize it. Then, she pulled something small from her pocket and placed it in Beck's hand. A pregnancy test. 2 clear red lines. There's one more who wants to stay too. Beck looked at the test in his hand, looked at Josie, then looked back at the test. Then he did something Josie had never seen. Something Della had never seen. Something Pax would never believe if anyone told him. Beck Moretti pulled Josie into his arms, buried his face in her hair, and his shoulders shook. For the first time in 22 years, he cried. That night, an autumn storm rolled into Savannah on the exact 1-year anniversary. Wind screamed through the oak woods. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began tapping the roof. Willa ran onto the porch, eyes bright, teddy bear in her arms. "B, the storm's here. Let's go to the storage building and read." Beck lifted Willa into his arms. Josie carried Shep. Della brought hot cocoa, and Sterling dropped by because he was afraid of storms, even though everyone knew he just wanted to be with the family. They all settled inside the old storage building, now warm and bright with light. Willa curled in Beck's lap and demanded a story. Shep babbled on Della's knees. Sterling sipped cocoa and watched them with eyes that shone. Josie sat beside Beck, leaning into his shoulder, and looked around the room. "Last year's storm night was the worst night of my life," she whispered. "Now I know it was the most beautiful, too." Beck kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "Sometimes the fiercest storms are what bring us back to the place we belong." Outside, the storm roared through ancient oaks. Rain lashed the glass. Thunder shook the Georgia sky. But inside Beckett Moretti's storage building, the man the outside world called a monster, a family was safe, was loved, was living. On the wall, 2 photos hung side by side. Bertie and Willa, both 4, both blonde, both smiling, 1 child lost and 1 child saved. Proof that even the darkest place can become home, and even the most dangerous people can be redeemed by a small hand gripping their pant leg and saying, "B." Josie and Beck's story is proof of a simple but profound truth. Love doesn't choose a perfect place to take root. It grows through cracks, in the darkest places, in people who seem too broken to mend. A mother's true strength isn't muscle. It's the decision to protect her children at any cost. And sometimes the person who saves us isn't a fairy tale hero. It's simply someone willing to open the door when we have nowhere else to go. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share this video with the people you love, because sometimes a story can light hope for someone who needs it. Don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Josie and Beck's journey? In real life, have you ever had a moment when a storm led you to the place you truly belonged? Share your thoughts and your story in the comments. We always want to hear what's deep in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.